15-year-old Pearl Pinson lived in Vallejo, California with her parents, older sister, and younger brother. She was a funny, outgoing girl who cared deeply for her family and was protective of her friends. She was excited to finally be in high school, and in May of 2016, she was just a few weeks away from completing her freshman year. Part of Pearl's morning routine involved a short walk from her home to Jesse Bethel High School, but on May 25th, 2016, she would never make it to school. Every day, Pearl used a pedestrian bridge which carries foot traffic over I-780 on her way to school. On the morning she was abducted, Pearl would make it to the bridge, but never across it. 911 calls began coming in, telling a horrifying story of a young woman being attacked up on the bridge. Callers described a man, brandishing a handgun, had attacked her. She was bleeding from her mouth, and when a Good Samaritan tried to intervene, he found himself on the other end of the attacker's gun. As witnesses scattered for cover, they heard a horrifying scream, followed by a single gunshot. Officers arrived on a confusing scene, with blood stains on the sidewalk and several eyewitnesses telling a similar, but slightly different story. They quickly identified the missing woman as 15-year-old Pearl Pinson. Eyewitness statements told the story of a violent attack, and one witness saw Pearl being shoved into the trunk of a car along with her backpack. This would be the last sighting of Pearl Pinson. Due to confusion in the statements and a lack of description, police struggled to gather enough evidence to issue an Amber Alert. They were able to discover the abductor was 19-year-old Fernando Castro, who lived in Pearl's neighborhood, but who, according to all reports, didn't have any connection to her. They issued an Amber Alert on his 1997 gold Saturn the next day, but vital hours had already been lost in the search for Pearl. The next day, surveillance cameras captured Castro in several locations, hundreds of miles away from the site of the abduction. California Highway Patrol initiated a pursuit, and Castro fled, eventually crashing his car and fleeing into a mobile home after exchanging gunfire with police. Desperate, Castro attempted to steal a truck, and as he got it moving, fired several more shots at authorities who shot back, fatally wounding him. The one man who may have known Pearl's whereabouts was now dead, and investigators had hundreds of miles of California terrain to search in hopes of finding an answer. In Castro's trunk, they would find blood, which would later be identified as that of Pearl Pinson. Despite knowing the abductor, investigators were baffled as to his motive, or what he could have done with Pearl. Forensic examination of the vehicle suggests that Pearl's injuries were not life-threatening, and the sheriff's department issued a statement that they believed there was a high likelihood that Pearl was still alive, and possibly being held against her will. Pearl's family issued a plea to the public for anyone with information to come forward, and an anonymous person donated $10,000 as a reward for information leading to Pearl's safe return. Where is Pearl Pinson, and why did Fernando Castro abduct her that morning? Was there a connection between the two which led to this shocking incident? Did Fernando have an obsession with Pearl and abducted her after stalking her for an unknown amount of time? Was Pearl sold into sex slavery and trafficked out of the country? Or did Fernando Castro murder Pearl and dispose of her body somewhere along his 350-mile trip? This is Trace Evidence, Episode 21, The Abduction of Pearl Pinson. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today's episode examines the brazen and violent abduction of 15-year-old Pearl Pinson from Vallejo, California. It's a strange story with difficult details. Before getting into the case, just a few notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on missing persons and unsolved murders. We are available across multiple platforms, and we're on iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, and many more. Trace Evidence has a Patreon for those of you who wish to support the podcast. It can be found at patreon.com/traceevidence. This podcast is a complete one-man operation, so if you enjoy it and wish to help support it, please check out the Patreon page. I'll be doing the September Patreon shoutouts at the end of this episode. I've also set up a one-time PayPal donation link on the main website for those of you who wish to contribute but don't want to use Patreon. Links, information, and more items including YouTube videos and full episode transcripts can be found on the website at trace-evidence.com. If you'd like to contact me, you can email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. Tweet me at traceevpod, that's TRACEEVPOD. Add me on Instagram at traceevidencepod, or join the Facebook discussion group simply by searching for Trace Evidence Podcast or clicking the direct link on our website. If you have questions, comments, or case suggestions, I'd love to hear from you. And as a final note, if you enjoy the show, please rate and review us on whatever app or platform you're listening on. The more ratings and reviews we get, the easier it becomes to find the podcast, and the more attention can be given to these cases. Today I look into the abduction of Pearl Pinson. It's a story you may have never heard, as it didn't exactly get massive media attention. It took place just a little over a year ago in Vallejo, California, and though details are thin, it's extremely important to keep this story alive, and for Pearl's name to be fresh in the public consciousness, as there's a good chance that she is still out there somewhere. This is episode 21, The Abduction of Pearl Pinson. Pearl Pinson was born on December 15, 2000, in Vallejo, California, to James Pinson and Joyce Mitchell. Vallejo is located in the North Bay region of San Francisco and is seated in Solano County. As of 2010, it had a population of 115,942, making it the 10th most populous city in the Bay Area. Pearl had two siblings, an older sister named Rose and a younger brother, William. Rose described her sister as having a boisterous personality, loving to have fun, and being an avid skateboarder. According to Rose, Pearl and William were extremely close, saying of them, quote, "He and Pearl are more like twins. They love to skateboard together," end quote. Pearl's former principal at Jesse Bethel High School described Pearl as the kind of girl who would always go out of her way for her friends and would frequently stand up for them if she saw them being treated poorly. Principal Kingston said, quote, "She has such a big heart. She's very articulate and concerned about justice. She's a feisty, strong woman," end quote. According to her sister, Rose, Pearl dreamed of being a firefighter, but also was a lover of animals and considered a career as a veterinarian. By May of 2016, Pearl was 15 years old and a 9th grader. On May 25th, she was in her last month as a freshman and excited for what the future had to offer. Pearl walked the short 10 to 15 minutes to school every day, but on May 25th, her normal routine would be interrupted by a violent and bizarre set of circumstances. Pearl is described as being a Caucasian female standing approximately 5'3" and weighing around 130 pounds. Her natural hair color is light brown, though it was dyed green when she was last seen, and she has blue-green eyes with a piercing on her lower lip on the left side. She was last seen wearing a black and white zip-up jacket, a gray sweater, black leggings, black and white Nike turf shoes, and a black Raiders beanie cap. She was also carrying a black and turquoise backpack with a Joker emblem on it. The Charlie Project also states that Pearl may be in need of medical attention, though whether or not she has a condition for which she required this attention is unspecified. Wednesday, May 25, 2016 began as any other day for Pearl Pinson. She got dressed, packed her bag, and shortly before 7 a.m. she began her short walk to Jesse Bethel High School. On Pearl's way to school, she was required to cross Interstate 780 via a pedestrian overpass with a corkscrew ramp leading to the causeway. The overpass led from Homeacres to Taylor Avenue. At approximately 7 a.m., Vallejo police began receiving distressing 911 calls depicting a violent incident at that location. The callers described a woman being attacked and possibly shot. I will play one of these 911 calls for you now.
Vallejo Police 911, what is your emergency?
Hello, somebody at the Kitty Walk to Vallejo, California. This guy shot. This guy was trying to rape her. That's all the info I could give.
I'm sorry, where?
On Cabrillo, the Kitty Walk. Cabrillo by Beverly Hills.
Okay, what happened, sir?
This guy was trying to rape this other girl, and all I heard was he aimed a gun at me because I seen something suspicious on my way to work. And then he aimed a gun at me, and I disappeared, and all I heard was a gunshot.
Okay, what? So this was on Cabrillo Street?
Cabrillo Street.
Okay. And what did this man look like?
He had a black hoodie.
What race was he?
A Mexican.
Black hoodie?
Black hoodie, Mexican, beard.
Beard? Okay, and what did the woman look like?
She's over there. She had green hair.
The woman had green hair? Was she white, black, Hispanic?
White.
It was on the street? Do you know
I
where?
don't know if he hit her if she got away, but I seen this guy down the street later on. And
you saw who?
Huh?
You saw who down the street?
This guy, I think it was a dad, I don't know, but I started running as fast as I can. I seen the guy. I tried to ask for help, and he said he recognized her. I think it was a granddaughter, and he left. He didn't ask me if they help him.
This was the second man. What did he look like?
He was a chubby guy with red sweats.
Red what? Red what, sir?
Red sweats and a cane.
And what race was he?
Well, he was like white, just like the girl.
And what was he doing? Was he with her?
He went to go rescue her.
On Cabrillo Street?
Oh, no, on the kiddie walk.
On the pedestrian crossing?
On the pedestrian crossing.
Okay, so did you see the man? He was trying to rape her, and did you say something about shooting?
Yes, I heard one shot.
You heard the shot?
She said, call the police, he's trying to shoot me. She had blood on her lips. Could you guys go as fast as you guys can?
We're already out there. What's your name?
I can't give you my name.
We're already out there looking for her.
Okay.
Okay. Are you the one wearing the... Can an officer come talk to you?
I mean, if you guys don't make it so obvious and try to give me pictures and try to expose me.
No, they're not going to do all that, sir. Where are you at right now? They can meet you there.
Well, actually, I'm on my way to work. I'm on the Carquinez Bridge, but...
Oh, you're already... Okay.
Several witnesses reported seeing a struggle ensuing between a young woman and an armed male. Several witnesses reported seeing the man wearing a hoodie dragging the young woman across the overpass. The victim was described as being a Caucasian female with green hair and a black and turquoise backpack, and was later identified as Pearl Pinson. They also described the man as possibly being Latino and wearing a black hoodie. Other reports were scattered, with some saying the woman was being assaulted, others saying that the man was attempting to rape her, and several believing that he was attempting to abduct her. According to one witness, he attempted to intervene in the situation and aid the woman, but the assailant spun around and pointed a gun at him. Witnesses began taking cover from the armed man, though many still had a view of what was going on, and said that the woman had a bloody face. At some point in time, though, it can't be pinpointed precisely when, Pearl screamed and a gunshot went off. Unfortunately, no one saw what exactly happened, and to this day it's unknown whether the gunshot was accidental, meant as a warning shot, or if Pearl herself was shot. Tragically, William Pinson, Pearl's younger brother, was on his way to school that morning and heard the scream and the gunshot, though he had no way of knowing that it was his sister who was being abducted. Leslie Caro, a witness to the incident, stated, quote, "It was like when you're getting chased and you're screaming for help, just like in the horror movies." End quote. By the time police arrived on the chaotic scene, both Pearl and her abductor were gone, and they had the incredibly challenging job of trying to sort out exactly what happened. Eyewitness testimony is often flawed and confusing. It can help, but when there are multiple witnesses, you're gonna receive varying accounts of what happened. On the scene, police found a small pool of blood and a cell phone. The police were able to positively identify Pearl Pinson as the victim when they tracked down her cell phone records. Authorities reportedly placed a call to Rose Pinson at approximately 7:35 a.m., telling her that they believed her sister had been kidnapped. Not believing this, Rose called the school to ask if Pearl was there, and she quickly learned that Pearl had never arrived. Unfortunately, since her cell phone was left behind at the scene, police had no ability to track her location. Several witnesses reported the abductor fled with Pearl on foot, though this seemed unlikely. One witness later came forward and said that he had seen Pearl's backpack, as well as Pearl herself, being shoved into the trunk of a car. The vehicle was described as being a gold 4-door 1997 Saturn. Due to a delay in the last witness coming forward, and conflicting reports about the abductor possibly fleeing on foot, there was a delay in the initialization of the Amber Alert system. For those of you who are unaware, there are specific requirements and guidelines that must be met in order for an Amber Alert to be issued. Law enforcement must confirm that it is a case of abduction first and foremost. The victim must be at risk for serious bodily harm or death. Law enforcement must have enough descriptive details to give the public, and that's where the issue with Pearl's abduction came in. According to amberalert.gov, quote, "This element requires as much descriptive information as possible about the abducted child, the abduction, as well as descriptive information about the suspect and the suspect's vehicle. Issuing alerts in the absence of significant information that an abduction has occurred could lead to abuse of the system and ultimately weaken its effectiveness." End quote. Police didn't immediately know the vehicle description, though Rose disagrees with this statement. When asked about the delay on the Amber Alert, Rose was upset with the way in which it was handled, saying, quote, "It was upsetting because they knew who he was and they knew the car he was in. They didn't have a license plate number, but they knew what car he was in and who he was, and I was upset because they refused to put it up. They had to wait 32 hours to put it up, and in those 32 hours, he could have done whatever he wanted with her." End quote. The conflicting reports, whether or not a vehicle was involved, descriptions of the suspect and the victim, resulted in the Amber Alert for Pearl not being issued until the afternoon of May 26th, more than 24 hours after she was abducted. Authorities immediately began searching the area and canvassing for any clues as to who may have taken Pearl and why. Descriptions of the vehicle and perpetrator allowed them to identify the suspect, 19-year-old Fernando Castro, a local who lived in Pearl's neighborhood and who was reported to have known Pearl, according to authorities, though Rose Pinson would say she remembered hearing Castro's name, but that the relationship between Pearl and Castro was no more than that of an acquaintance. Pearl and Castro lived only 3 blocks apart, but despite the proximity, there isn't believed to be a connection between the two beyond seeing each other on occasion in passing. According to Rose, police did forensic searches of both Castro and Pearl's phones and found no record that the two ever contacted one another. There were, of course, unsubstantiated rumors that Pearl and Castro had been involved in some type of a relationship, or that they knew each other well, but this could never be proven, and there appears to be no evidence to support those claims. Over the course of the next 24 hours, police received multiple tips reporting sightings of Pearl in the area locally and as far away as the state of Washington. Surveillance cameras captured the first images of Castro's vehicle on Thursday morning. According to the official timeline, Castro was seen at 9:13 a.m. in the westbound lane of I-580. 7 minutes later at 9:20 a.m., he was again seen by cameras near Sir Francis Drake Boulevard in Marin County. 15 minutes after that, Castro was spotted again, southbound on the 101 near the Golden Gate Bridge. The Amber Alert for Pearl was officially launched several hours later, sometime between 1 p.m. and 2:30 p.m. Quickly thereafter, at approximately 3 p.m., a witness sighted and reported Castro's position. He was seen driving south on the 101 in the Los Alamos area of Santa Barbara County. Across all surveillance footage and this witness's sighting, Pearl was never seen in the vehicle. The California Highway Patrol managed to catch up to Castro on Highway 101, and a high-speed pursuit ensued. Christine Castillo, a deputy with the Solano County Sheriff's Department, stated, quote, "You know, the room was silent. The room went silent because everybody was holding on and waiting for every word that was said on that radio. And you know, is there any sign of Pearl? I think that feeling, regardless of the outcome of this case, is going to sit with everybody involved, forever." End quote. There is also a conflicting report that the Highway Patrol spotted Castro earlier in San Luis Obispo County and pursued him into the Santa Barbara County line. According to police, the pursuit ended when Castro crashed his vehicle into a mobile home in Rancho Santa Ynez Mobile Estates in Solvang Park. Castro exited the vehicle and ran into the home. Moments later, the homeowner came running out. At this point, Castro exited the home and began firing at officers while attempting to steal a truck. Castro continued to fire at Solano County Sheriff's officers who returned fire. Castro got into the truck, got it started, and began driving back towards Fjord Drive, where he was again firing at deputies who shot back, hitting him this time and fatally injuring him. When the shooting stopped, officers approached the vehicle and found Castro dead inside. Unfortunately, the one man who may have known the exact whereabouts of Pearl Pinson was now dead, and with him the answers to those questions. According to the police, they found blood in the trunk, which was later matched to Pearl Pinson. Castillo would later state, quote, "The trace of blood we found in the trunk is consistent with whatever injury she had when she was abducted, but it wasn't a significant enough amount of blood to indicate that it wasn't survivable. So we still feel very much hopeful that we're going to bring Pearl home, that she's being held somewhere against her will, or she's being passed from person to person, but that she is still alive." End quote. Of the shooting, Solano County Sheriff Thomas Ferrara stated, quote, "He drove a little ways, got out, shot at deputies, they returned fire. The suspect is dead, and at this point, we believe that suspect is probably Fernando Castro." End quote. Information about Castro is notoriously difficult to get, as the police have released very little information on him. There doesn't appear to be an apparent criminal history. There have been no statements made about whether or not he was involved in drugs or suffered from any mental illnesses. It's fairly startling to have a suspect involved in such a crime, and to find so few facts about who he was or what his motives may have been. There's really only been rumor and speculation, with some claiming that Castro was part of a gang and heavily involved in criminal activities, while others said that he was a perfectly nice guy with no ties to any gangs. What we do know is that after his death, police searched his home and found what they described to be several disturbing notes, as well as unreleased pieces of information, which pointed them towards the area of Jenner, California, a small coastal town of only 2.4 square miles. They reportedly also found information regarding his cell phone, suggested to be pings, showing his location, which suggests that he had a connection to Jenner. According to an unidentified source, police discovered a receipt in Castro's car which had handwritten directions on it to Jenner. Police also issued a statement requesting that the public be on the lookout for Pearl's backpack. The distinctive black and turquoise bag with the Joker emblem was not found inside the vehicle nor amongst Castro's possessions, and authorities believe that the whereabouts of the backpack could indicate a possible location for Pearl herself. Given all of the information they had, police believed that Pearl was still alive, and based on that assumption, they began massive searches of several different areas where they believe she may be. Unfortunately, due to the route Castro drove and the more than 350 miles he covered, Pearl could have been in any number of areas. According to Deputy Castillo, quote, "This case spans from northern to southern California." End quote. In a statement issued to the press, Rose stated, quote, "No matter who you're with, how they're treating you, do not give up. I mean, I love you, and I'm not gonna stop." End quote. That Friday, police engaged in a search of over 4 square miles near the mouth of the Russian River. Officials from state parks and agencies in Sonoma and Marin counties all came together to pool their resources in their search efforts, conducting land and air searches. Local authorities were also joined by the FBI. On the morning of Saturday, May 28th, more than 65 law enforcement officers combined with search and rescue personnel tackled 25 square miles surrounding the Willow Creek area, a campground in Jenner, but found no signs of Pearl. Later that afternoon, they called off the search. In addition to Willow Creek, search parties also exhausted efforts along the Glen Cove coastline area of Vallejo, the field and stream near the original site of the abduction, much of the area along Highway 37 which stretches from Vallejo to Sonoma County, and the area of Skaggs Island. Unfortunately, none of these searches produced any results. In a statement released to the media, the Solano County Sheriff's Department said, quote, "Nothing was found during the search which would indicate Pearl is there. Investigators continue to follow up on leads, and any future search will depend on where those leads take us." End quote. For the next few months, authorities struggled with a lack of leads, and in their desperation for answers, They scoured over hundreds of hours of surveillance footage from homes, businesses, and traffic cameras in hopes that they may find more information on Castro's travels, or at least a sign of Pearl. Despite their efforts, none of the footage they found showed Pearl. One surveillance camera showed Castro the morning after the abduction at the Bodega Bay gas station. Bodega Bay is just 10 miles from Jenner, California. There was no evidence of Pearl in his company, though it did lead investigators to check the area and canvass for any witnesses who may have seen anything, but again, their efforts failed to produce results. An anonymous benefactor donated $10,000 for information which may lead to the recovery of Pearl Pinson. Flyers were produced and handed out and put up all over the state of California, seeking answers and assistance as to where Pearl may be. On the 25th of every month, Pearl's family holds a candlelight vigil and works hard to keep her name present in the public. Since the early part of the investigation, Rose has taken on the responsibility of being the spokesperson for the family. In December of 2016, the family sadly celebrated Pearl's Sweet 16 without her. She had requested a party with an Oakland Raiders theme, which they went forward with. Despite the passage of months, nothing new was found, and by May of 2017, a year after her disappearance, her family struggled to cling to hope that she would come home someday. The family expressed some frustration with the police over the shooting of Castro, feeling that he was their best hope in locating Pearl, but with him dead, there was no one left to question. Rose stated, quote, "We don't know where he took her, what he did with her, or why he even took her. The question is why, or where's she at?" End quote. Pearl's father James, when asked about the situation, said, quote, "They knew the importance of getting him alive, but they took the guy's life." End quote. Though many understand the family's frustration, authorities assured the public that they had wanted to take Castro into custody, but had no choice but to defend themselves and other potential victims when he began firing at them. The family returned to the scene of the abduction on the 1-year anniversary, a pedestrian overpass now adorned with graffiti in relation to Pearl. Standing where their daughter was last seen, Pearl's mother said, quote, "Pearl, I love you. Please come home." End quote. And her father added, quote, "Baby, we have not stopped looking for you." End quote. It's been over a year since Pearl Pinson was abducted and seemingly vanished into thin air. The prime suspect and the only man who may have been able to lead authorities to Pearl was killed in a shootout, and no knowledge could be gleaned from him. There's still a debate about whether or not Pearl Pinson is alive and in captivity, or if she was murdered by Castro. According to police, they have, to this day, found no significant evidence to suggest that Castro murdered Pearl. They've also failed to come up with a motive for the attack and abduction in the first place, or at least have chosen not to reveal those details to the public. There's a strong air of mystery and confusion around this case, and unfortunately, many people get so caught up in the circumstances of Pearl's abduction and the details surrounding Castro's death that they lose sight of the fact that a 15-year-old girl was abducted and has vanished without a trace. In the year since the abduction took place, several theories have been brought to light, some put forth by the family, some by the police, and some from online investigators. One theory is that Pearl was abducted by Castro due to a lingering issue between the two of them. According to this theory, Pearl and Castro knew each other much better than has been told, and may have been involved in a relationship, or Castro wanted a relationship which Pearl was not interested in. Followers of this theory suggest that Castro approached Pearl, and when she told him to leave her alone, he became angry and violent. At this point, he tried to get her into his car. She was injured in the scuffle, and when others took notice, Castro produced a pistol to frighten them off or to convince Pearl to get into the car. What his exact intentions were beyond this, the theory comes up short in. The second theory is that Castro had seen Pearl around the neighborhood and had developed an attraction to her. This attraction led Castro to the point of obsession, and he began stalking Pearl. He learned her route to school and chose that particular day as the time to abduct her. When things went wrong, many have theorized that Castro murdered Pearl and dumped her body somewhere along his travels. They point to his firefight with police as an indication that he no longer felt he had anything to lose, and that if he had simply abducted someone who was still alive, he would have been less likely to lose his own life in a gunfight. The final and most popular theory is one which has been stated by both police and Pearl's own family, that Castro may have abducted Pearl in order to traffic her. Police believe she may still be alive, but being held against her will. They've said she could be being passed from person to person, and have not ruled out the possibility of sex trafficking, and that Castro may have known individuals involved in it, or have been looking to make some fast money, and chose who he believed would be an easy target. Pearl's own sister Rose has said, quote, "Honestly, I think she's in sex trafficking. She could be anywhere with anybody, but I believe she's still alive and I'm not going to stop believing until I have proof." End quote. According to Human Trafficking Hotline, since 2007, there have been over 21,225 cases of human trafficking in the state of California alone, with most of the victims being women or children. Pearl Pinson was a bright and beautiful young woman with a huge heart and a loving soul. There wasn't a person around her who didn't feel gifted by her presence. Then, in one terrible moment, she was taken away and hasn't been seen again. It's a terrible story and a haunting question without a legitimate answer. What happened to Pearl Pinson? And what was it that drove Fernando Castro to abduct her early that Wednesday morning? As time has passed, there have been fewer answers than expected. Police have remained tight-lipped about Castro himself and any possible motive for the crime. Witnesses to the abduction have come forward, but friends and family members of Castro have remained quiet about what his intentions may have been and what drove him into this dark place. It's been a year and nearly 4 months since Pearl Pinson was abducted on her way to school, and her family continues to hold out hope that she will be safely returned to them. Until someone comes forward with new information, new leads can be developed, or some sign of Pearl can be discovered, she remains missing and her case is unsolved. Pearl Pinson was 15 years old when she was abducted. Think about where you were when you were 15 and just try to imagine the absolute terror you would have experienced if something like this happened to you. She was just a girl walking to school, so close to finishing 9th grade, when a violent man approached her and kidnapped her for no apparent reason. Nothing about this makes sense, and sadly, we don't have any answers over a year later. Pearl's brother was walking to school and heard his sister cry out for help, but he didn't know it was her, and I find that detail incredibly heartbreaking. In a few interviews, Pearl's sister Rose has said that their brother has taken it really hard and holds himself responsible for not knowing and not being able to protect his sister. That's something no one should have to live with, but due to the actions of one sick person, an entire family was shattered on May 25, 2016. The abduction of Pearl Pinson is one of those cases that's so shocking and brazen that I can't believe more people haven't heard of it. There are a ton of news articles on this case, but they all tend to regurgitate the same information. To find something new, or a piece of the story that you haven't seen before, can take a while. I had to look at twice as much information on this case as almost any of my other cases because the information is distributed so unevenly. As has been the story recently for me, information about the victim is thin, at least prior to her abduction. I do my best to make the victim the focus of each episode, and in this case I had very little to work with. Regardless of that, I think it's extremely important to not forget that, at the end of the day, we're discussing a horrible incident that happened to a 15-year-old girl who was just on her way to school. All you have to do is look at pictures of Pearl Pinson to be reminded that she's just a kind, innocent girl who faced a terrible situation for no reason at all. In the aftermath, her family has been left without answers, and investigators have remained baffled as to why it happened and where Pearl was taken. The entire incident is extremely bizarre, and what makes it more frustrating is not knowing why it happened or what happened afterwards. Several witnesses saw or heard what was going on the pedestrian bridge that morning, and a few called 911 to report the abduction. According to all accounts, Pearl was approached by Castro, there was some kind of a struggle, and Pearl was injured. There was a single witness who said that Pearl was bleeding from the mouth, and when police arrived they found blood on the bridge. One witness said that he saw Pearl being shoved into the trunk of Castro's car, while others were ducking for cover following the gunshot. Police later found blood in the trunk, confirming that Pearl had been in there. The interesting thing is that the police note that, though blood was in the trunk, they don't believe it was enough to suggest that Pearl had been shot. On the bridge that day, witnesses heard Pearl scream, followed by a gunshot. Initially, this led many to believe that she had been shot and this is why she stopped screaming, but evidence suggests that Pearl wasn't shot at all. This leads investigators to believe that she may in fact have been kept alive and either murdered later, left somewhere desolate, or given over to a third party. Before moving into the theories, I wanted to address one specific piece of this case. In a lot of the cases I cover, there are obvious errors in investigation or glaring mistakes made by the police. I don't consider this one of those cases, and while I understand the frustration of Pearl's family, I think the situation revolving around the Amber Alert and the shooting of Castro have to be looked at closely before you leap to any conclusions. Starting with the Amber Alert, there are specific guidelines in place that they have to adhere to before they can issue an alert. Rose would argue that they knew who took Pearl and that they knew the vehicle, but according to all of the research I've done, much of that information came out hours later when a witness came forward to report it. At the initial scene, they had a chaotic situation to deal with, and they needed to weed through conflicting reports. Some people didn't even see a car, and they wanted to be really sure. Although it doesn't sound like a big deal, if you issue an Amber Alert describing a vehicle without knowing for certain, anyone driving that vehicle could be called into police, and it's going to really spread your resources thin to be tracking down and pulling over every car of that type and color. In the Castro shooting, I honestly don't think police had a choice. Based on his driving, Castro proved he was a danger to the public. If he had simply crashed, I think things might have turned out differently, but when he entered an innocent person's home brandishing a weapon, stole another vehicle, and then fired shots at police, he was essentially endangering not only the police but anyone in that vicinity. If they hadn't shot back, he may have driven off and could have proven to have been an even bigger danger. Castro was obviously desperate, armed, and dangerous. Though it would have been the optimal result for police to have captured or merely wounded him, they were being shot at and they returned fire. In moments like that, I don't know that you have the ability to take the time to consider all of your options. In addition to this, Castro was in the driver's seat of a truck, so even if they had wanted to, police didn't have the option to just shoot him in the leg. Although I deeply wish Castro had survived so that he could have answered questions, I can't judge how the police responded to him shooting at them that day. The theories revolving around this case are mostly thin, but considering the lack of information we have, that isn't surprising. This case is different than most of the others I've covered because, at least in terms of the abduction, we have a very vivid picture of what happened. Several people witnessed it and were able to describe the attack. We know that Castro put Pearl in the trunk of his car and drove off with her, and we know that Castro was the man who was responsible for this. That's where our knowledge ends. And whereas usually we don't know for sure who was involved, in this instance, it's what happened afterward that leaves us baffled and confused. As a result of this, the theories are about why Castro took Pearl and what he did with her afterward. The first theory is that Castro abducted Pearl because of some sort of issues or dispute between the two of them. This theory assumes that Pearl knew Castro on more than an acquaintance basis, though her family disputes that. There have been rumors that Castro and Pearl knew each other much better than that, and some have even hinted that the two had been involved in a relationship, though there doesn't appear to be any evidence to suggest that's true. It's really hard to say, but if I operate only in terms of evidence, there really isn't anything to connect Castro to Pearl prior to the abduction, other than the fact that they live 3 blocks apart, and Rose has said she vaguely recalls hearing his name. That being said, I think it would be an extremely odd coincidence that Castro would abduct Pearl, a girl from his neighborhood who he had seen before and who had seen him, completely at random. What are the odds that on that particular morning, Castro, who we know was driving, just happened to be passing by the pedestrian bridge where he suddenly saw Pearl and decided that he should abduct her? That's one of the stranger details of this case. The abduction took place on the bridge over the interstate, a bridge that a car can't fit onto. So how did Castro end up on that bridge with Pearl? There's only a few scenarios which I could imagine led to this. Either Castro just happened to be by the corkscrew ramp and saw Pearl going up it and decided to follow her, Or Castro followed Pearl that day, and when he saw Pearl ascend the pedestrian bridge, he decided to make his move. Or there's the possibility that Castro had stalked Pearl, knew her morning routine, and was already on the bridge waiting for her that morning. I'm not a huge believer in coincidence, and a large part of me believes that Castro was either following Pearl that morning or was already up there waiting for her. I don't believe we're dealing with a totally random abduction, which would possibly lend credence to the fact that Castro and Pearl may have known each other a little bit more than her family believes. Castro had a gun on him that day, which to me suggests that he either drove around every day with a gun or he had plans to use it that day. Police would later search in the Willow Creek area of Jenner, California, based on information they got from Castro's phone, his home, and a receipt in his car, which would also imply that this was planned out beyond just the abduction. I do think there's a chance that this abduction was based on some interaction between the two, and some have theorized that Castro may have been attracted to Pearl, but that she didn't return those feelings and he became angry about it. That's as much a possibility as anything else in this case. But in terms of this theory, I do consider it more likely than not that there was some connection between these two prior to the abduction. The second theory follows a similar line as the first, though it suggests different possible motives. This theory focuses more in on the possibility that Castro had become obsessed with Pearl over time, and may have even been stalking her. Since I began investigating this case, I couldn't help but wonder if Castro was suffering from some kind of mental illness. And though it's purely speculation on my part, it isn't uncommon for someone with issues to become obsessed with someone, and to imagine that there is something there that isn't. I don't think it's normal for someone to abduct a 15-year-old girl at gunpoint in broad daylight in front of witnesses. To me, there has to be more at work beneath the surface than we've been publicly made aware of. Castro's past, his possible criminal history, has all been kept under wraps for one reason or another. He's been one of the most difficult criminals I've ever researched for an episode, as almost nothing exists about him. Typically in a case like this, especially one with so few answers, extensive investigation of his past and behavior around the time of the abduction would have been conducted, and I'm sure it was, but I haven't seen anything about it. Without more information, it's nearly impossible to say whether or not this crime was influenced in any way by mental illness, drugs, or was the case of an obsessive stalker going too far. Castro's family has had little to say about the crime, and appear to be as baffled as everyone else as to what caused their son to commit this heinous act. On the other hand, certain individuals close to Pearl and her family have speculated that Castro had psychological problems, and his family was aware of them, but chose not to seek treatment for him. Whether or not that's accurate, there's really no way of knowing. I honestly don't feel like there's enough information available to come down to a decision on this theory. Considering my feelings about Pearl being followed or stalked, I certainly think there's a possibility that this is a case of someone becoming obsessed, and that it may tie into some sort of psychological or substance abuse problems, but there's just not enough information to confirm that. The final theory is the most well-known and popular, and it surmises that Pearl was abducted in order to be sold into sex slavery and human trafficking. There are a few factors here which lend credence to this. First and foremost, based on the amount of blood in the trunk of Castro's car, investigators felt it was highly unlikely that Pearl had sustained any fatal injuries and essentially ruled out the chance that she had been shot. To this day, investigators believe that when Pearl was in the trunk, she was still alive and could very well still be alive today. Using surveillance camera footage and pings from Castro's cell phone, police were able to get a good idea of where he traveled. From the time he abducted Pearl to the moment he was shot, Castro traveled over 350 miles, which is a contributing factor as to why search efforts struggled. This is a lot of land to cover, and one officer even referred to it by saying that it was a needle in a haystack, but that might even be a generous description. Many people don't believe that a 19-year-old could have pulled off this abduction and managed to dispose of Pearl without someone helping him or someone to whom he had delivered her. California has a large underground for sex trafficking, and young girls and women are most likely to be abducted for this purpose. If the unknown source is correct in his statement that there was a receipt in Castro's car which had directions to Jenner, California, There's a possibility that he was meeting someone there in order to deliver Pearl for some unknown reason. Considering how much authorities have discussed the possibility of her being trafficked, and that her own sister believes that this is what happened to her, I'm inclined to believe that authorities may have uncovered information which gave them this belief. What that information could be, we don't know because they've been very tight-lipped about this aspect of the case. But I don't think it's a theory they would just throw out there without having some kind of basis for it. I do believe there's a good possibility that Pearl was in fact trafficked, but there's one aspect of this case which has always made me question this possibility. Castro fled from police and led them on a high-speed pursuit. In his desperation, he crashed his car, stole a truck, and exchanged fire with authorities. There's a big part of me that feels like if Castro had simply abducted Pearl and gave her to someone else, he wouldn't have been so willing to die for this. The fact that Castro was willing to risk his own life, to me, suggests that he believed if he were captured, he was likely going to jail for the rest of his life. I can only speculate, but I've always felt that there was a high likelihood that Castro was so violent and willing to die because he knew Pearl was dead, and if he were caught, he knew the police would make him pay for it. If this was merely an abduction, and even if trafficking were involved, it seems more likely that you'd try to escape, but you wouldn't be willing to die to keep something secret. I don't want to go into much of the gory details of what I believe is likely to have happened that day, but I just find it extremely odd that someone would be willing to go to such extremes if he weren't already aware of having done something horrible. If you factor in that Pearl has not been sighted since that day, and no signs or traces of her were ever recovered, I think there's just as much chance that she was murdered as there is that she was trafficked. The abduction of Pearl Pinson is a terribly tragic story. A 15-year-old girl taken away from her life, a family left behind without answers, and a search which was never able to produce any results. The abductor is dead, and his family is left wondering why their son did such a terrible thing, but they too lack any real answers. Investigators devoted countless man-hours to search efforts, studying surveillance footage and canvassing large areas of California, and still remain baffled as to what could have happened to Pearl in the 33 hours between the time she was abducted and the fatal shootout with Fernando Castro. This is one of those cases that sticks with you, a total mystery that makes no sense on the surface, and the deeper you go, the more complex and frustrating it becomes. What happened to Pearl Pinson? She vanished from the streets of Vallejo, California on May 25, 2016, and hasn't been seen since. We can only hope that she's still alive, and not in an absolutely terrible situation, but the odds are not in favor of that likelihood. If Pearl is still alive, then someone knows where she is, and we can only hope that this person will eventually come forward and tell authorities what they need to know to bring her home safely. If Pearl was murdered, then there are hundreds of miles of California wilderness in which she may have been concealed, and the likelihood that she will be discovered is slim. There's a $10,000 reward out for information leading to the recovery of Pearl Pinson. She is not forgotten, and I truly hope that one day we will have the answers to this incredibly disturbing story, and that Pearl will be brought home safely. If you're interested in finding more information about the abduction of Pearl Pinson, there are many websites and news articles you can read. Pearl's sister Rose has a YouTube channel where she discusses her missing sister. If you have more information about the disappearance of Pearl Pinson, please contact the FBI, Solano County Sheriff's Department, or your local police. What do you believe happened to Pearl Pinson? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. For those of you who don't know, Trace Evidence has a Patreon page where you can help support the podcast. It's located at patreon.com/traceevidence. It's time for me to do my monthly shout out to new patrons from the month of September. A special thank you to Patrick Mullen, Trevor, Tara J, Rachel Fusco, Andrew Eastwood, Lana Greenland, Sinead Donnery, Amanda Blackburn, Kimberly Schlinke, Karina Perry, and Brock Randolph. Huge apology to anyone whose name I may have butchered in that reading. You guys help make this podcast better, and I'm incredibly indebted to you for your support. For those of you who are in the tier to receive stickers, I'll be mailing them out this week. Thank you again for your generosity. Also, the first Patreon exclusive episode is currently being written, and it's a long one, so it'll be coming along soon, and I hope you'll enjoy it. I want to thank you for listening to this episode of Trace Evidence, and invite you to check out the website at trace-evidence.com. You can find links to the Patreon, all social media accounts, as well as places to download and subscribe to the podcast. I'm always eager to hear your feedback, so if you enjoyed this episode, please give us a good rating on iTunes and leave us a review. This will greatly help our reach and bring more attention to the cases we cover. I'm going to leave you with a preview of another true crime podcast that I think you should give a listen, hosted by two incredible women. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.
Hello, fellow skin suits. This is Angel.
And Ember.
Deep down, do you have a secret passion for true crime, sarcasm, inappropriate jokes, but you still want to hear all those lovely details?
However, you still need a little bit of humor to get you through those dark moments?
Then come hang out with us over at the Color Me Dead podcast.
We try to balance both humor and facts perfectly.
We also go on some pretty extraordinary squirrel hunts.
We can be found on iTunes and all other podcast apps.
Come over to Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram and see us at Color Me Dead Podcast for the latest updates and gory chat. We release on Wednesdays because on Wednesdays we wear murder.
Don't forget to spay and neuter your pets
and stay out of chalk lines.